Welcome to episode 200 of the XS Noize Podcast, where we focus on in-depth interviews with musicians, artists, and people involved in the music industry. I'm your host, Mark Millar. Thanks for listening. In this episode, I speak to acclaimed Northern Irish singer-songwriter Ciaran Lavery about his stunning new album, Light Entertainment. If you missed the previous episode, I spoke to Richard Archer from Hard-Fi about their new EP, Don't Go Making Plans. So check it out, and if you like the podcast, please subscribe on your favourite listening platform, give us a rating, and leave a comment. Light Entertainment is Ciaran Lavery's fifth studio album and his most multi-layered work yet, full of trademark wit and inviting listeners into a strange, intense world. The album is accompanied by a short film following Lavery through surreal scenes inspired by classic film noir and early 2000s indie films. In this episode, Ciaran discusses the inspiration behind the album, working with Daniel O'Donnell, how he nearly became a rapper, and much more. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the XS Noize Podcast with Ciaran Lavery. Hi Ciaran, welcome to the XS Noize Podcast.
Thanks so much, Mark. Thanks for having us and for taking the time as well. I really appreciate it.
No, I really enjoying the album. It's absolutely fantastic. But before we get into the album in depth, I'd like to go back to the start. So can you tell me, who were some of your earliest musical influences and how have they shaped your music?
I was lucky enough to grow up around a time and sort of enter my teenage years at a time when Eminem arrived, and the Slim Shady LP was hugely informative for a lot of other music that I listened to probably around the age of 14. And it had that perfect kind of language, and also, you know, the aggression and everything about it was pretty much garnering a lot of attention of both myself and my friends, who were all, you know, very strangely trying to figure out, you know, yourself, and also being a teenager. And so I think music that speaks to this sort of confused age, and also the constant battles between, you know, ourselves as teenagers and our school teachers and our parents. And so I guess Eminem and that album in particular for me was probably the equivalent of what punk music would have done to a generation before, who maybe felt as if this music is speaking directly to me. And also, you know, I will absolutely take credit for the fact that it arrived at a time when I was already teetering with this idea that I could potentially become a rapper. And so the only stumbling block at that point was there were no white rappers really that I could look at and think, oh, well, there's a potential avenue, and here's someone who's doing it. And so whenever Eminem arrived, myself and my friends, we had one of those multi-pens. Do you remember the ones that had like the red, green, black and blue kind of options on it, and you could press them down? So we had one of those, and we used to sit at the back of maths class, and we would spit rhymes, as it were, and we would, you know, one line at a time with our different pen color. And I remember the career kind of hit a brief and very, very sudden brick wall when my friends, I think his parents, found one of our raps in his blazer pocket, and he basically just blamed it on some poor bastard that was in our class, and that was the hip hop career kind of started and ended inside a week. But in a way, it sort of switched my brain on to that style of music, and so I got really heavily into, I mean, it's a straight line between Eminem and Dr. Dre, and then that sort of led me down all of the West Coast hip hop that was happening in the 90s, and then I would retract further back into the 80s, and I was also, I mean, when I think about these things now, I was such a fan of the kind of West Coast hip hop movement, and also very aware of the feuds that had happened in the 90s between the likes of Notorious B.I.G. and Tupac, and I was so loyal to Tupac that I didn't listen to anything from New York or anything from the East Coast of America until I was maybe in my 20s, and I had to wise myself up. And, because any other time, if someone passed me an album from Nas or even, Snoop was kind of weird as well, where he would teeter and kind of collaborate on both sides. And I never knew how I felt about him. I think about it now, I was very stupid. But the point being, I was pretty much very heavily influenced by that sort of style of music throughout my teen years. And as well as that, I listened to a lot of pop punk. And the first instrument that I picked up, I think it was 15. I started playing the guitar, and myself and my friend Stephen McGurk, we formed a garage band. I think this is probably the story of every teenager that has ever existed and that could get their hands on an instrument. So we formed a garage band, and yeah, every Saturday we used to play in his garage, and then we had a bass player in as well. We basically, over the course of maybe a year, we learned as much Green Day as we possibly could, as much that was humanly possible. But again, I was too shy to sing, and none of the other two guys sang. So we just became this strange instrumental Green Day tribute band that never left a garage. And I actually met McGurk recently, and he was reminding me that at one point we used to record our practice sessions then, and I haven't heard them, but I can only imagine how woeful they are. And he took it upon himself to send a tape of our instrumentals to a guy that was in the Shadows, which was Cliff Richard's band, and also the Shadows. So he sent a tape to this guy in the Shadows. I can't remember I think he kind of sent it with a letter as well. Probably looked completely psychotic. And fair play, the guy sent a handwritten letter back, just pretty much giving us stick at it, boys. You'll do well. Thankfully, that career kind of path and that genre washed over me in terms of instrumental pop punk bands. I don't know if there are many that, and whether there's an appetite for that even in as a fan base. But yeah, I think I'm probably like a lot of teens back then. I was essentially a sponge when it came to music and when it came to things that caught my ear. So I was very heavily influenced by that sort of somewhere crossing over between pop punk and hip hop was a huge influence. And then my brother-in-law, who is cited as having brainwashed me since around the age of 15 or 16 as well. He used to he would leave these CDs at the house, and he would put post-it notes on them, and there would be a lot of the singer-songwriters from 60s and 70s, a lot of California sort of music, a lot of early Woodstock kind of songwriters, Arlo Guthrie, there's a lot of Neil Young in there, Carl King in there, Joni Mitchell, and I treated them the way that I would have treated homework, where I really wanted to impress Stephen and also not let him down and not listen to these songs. So I would have meticulously sat and listened through to everything. And he on the little post-it notes, he would have said, listen to track 3, 7, whatever, blah, blah, and tell me what you thought the next time I see you. And so then he would inevitably call the house back with my sister, and then we'd have a discussion about the songs, and I try to obviously I'm trying to impress him with all of this research. So I think over those kind of amalgamation of those genres ended up forming and informing what my kind of musical interest was in around those days, and I still have a lot of love for that style and those styles, both individually and I love when people kind of are very playful with a few of the kind of crossover. I know that it became obviously a big thing that Kanye West would have sampled quite well-known songs like cross-genre sort of rock songs, and then when he had that whole thing with Paul McCartney, I mean, I wasn't as interested then, but the idea that you could cross the great divide in terms of genres. I guess that really interested me, that the fact that some people were just breaking rules, and creating new types of music. And in that sense, I think I was always then drawn to artists like Tom Waits and Bjork, and people who can't really be defined by a genre and just basically they create their own genre. And so, when you hear a Bjork song, when you hear a Tom Waits song, it's just very identifiable. So yeah, very long answer for a question that I can't even recall what exactly it was.
When you were listening to those songs, looking at the post-it notes and listening to the CDs and certain tracks and then having to report back and what the song was about and stuff, did that inform you further down the line in your songwriting, help you understand the structures of songs and how to tell a story?
Yeah, you know what? I think it's fairly common, and I don't think I'm the only one who had this journey with songwriting in terms of I tended to just at the start, before I knew what I wanted to say and before I knew much about my own personality and my own voice, I basically mimicked songs that I really admired to a degree, where it's probably ripping them off. But there were elements of songwriters that I really loved. And I think I would have just tried on different things the same way, and it's like going clothes shopping. You might think a leather jacket looks good, then you try it on, you realize I look horrible in this, and then that's just somewhere you don't go back to anymore. And I think that's the exact same way that I approached songwriting, where I tried on different things, and if they felt natural, then I knew, okay, that is, speaking to me in a way that I can potentially refine that further, or it's a sign that, it feels alien or it feels false to be trying this. I certainly never attempted the sort of Bob Dylan voice of the late 60s, where he was just kind of like somewhere on a tightrope between being in tune and out of tune. So I'm glad to say I didn't go that far, but I did pretty much rip off as much as possible, in a way to help me find the different sounds and structures of songs that I felt were easier for me then to apply my own songwriting on top of.
Well, can you remember the first song that you wrote that you thought, right, this is a good song, this is the best thing I've written?
No, I've never had that with songs. I've never had that with songs. I think I find songs that I write quickly. I have a sense of, okay, that feels finished, and also, if it was quick or if it happened within 20 minutes, half an hour of sitting down, or whether it's something that I have to keep revisiting. That's kind of where I differentiate between songs and in terms of how I feel about them. I don't think I'm probably too close and too critical, that I never put the pen down or the instrument down and think I've nailed it. This is the best thing that I've ever written, because I'd be too afraid of, what happens if another song comes around the corner, but I'm already, washing my hands and I'm out the door. And I think it's like anything else in terms of, how every songwriter individually works. I tend to find that songs can arrive in batches for me. And so if I have written one song, it's quite common that by the time I finish that song, I have the start of another song just coming. So I tend to just maybe write in batches of twos or threes. And, sometimes that is refining the original idea and coming at it from a different vantage point, or a whole other idea altogether. I think I tend to not question it, and I've just followed the workflow in that sense, and that has always felt natural to me. So I really wish I would have had that sense of, this is it, this is the best thing ever. But I think there's a sense of, all I have is, it feels finished, and I feel good about that being finished, and I don't need to tamper with it. I really like the idea of, once it's written, that's it, it's written.
Do you have a particular ritual or environment where you feel most creative?
I used to be very strict about it, and I think I probably was because I used to write a lot in my bedroom, and there's something kind of quite nostalgic about that. So I think it maybe felt like a safe space for me to write, even as an adult. I would have written at the end of the bed, because that's what I did when I was a teenager. And there's probably some, element of secrecy and embarrassment about, I'm in my room just doing this thing. But I think with the amount of traveling that I was doing at one point, and also with kind of wanting to push myself into different areas, I became much more flexible with my songwriting. So certainly over the last couple of years, I would challenge myself to write without an instrument at all, or I would write with a very specific instrument. And again, it's almost the same as, changing the routine ever so slightly and seeing, does this work? Would I get a different result? And is the result more interesting than if I just keep going back to that comfortable space? Or is the comfortable space that's, the only place that I could write? And so I never wanted to be chained to, that same writing space that I can only work in, because if I'm not in that space, I would hate to think that I can't write at all. So I've tried to kind of challenge that idea. And so in short, I think I'm much more flexible about where I write and how I write. I just know there's a strange kind of sense that if I don't mean to, for this to sound daft or whatever, but I have a weird gut feeling that something is arriving. Like there's an idea that is starting to turn the cogs. And so when I get that feeling, then I know I should probably sit down soon and see what comes of this. And that can happen anywhere, whether I'm out driving or shopping or, just walking the dogs or, so I think that's why I wanted to be more flexible so that I can start working on an idea, even if I'm, a fair distance from the place where the instrument is.
Is it usually a musical idea, or would it be a lyrical idea, or an idea for a story or a song title? What usually comes first?
Good question. I think it varies. Sometimes I'll have a line that has been kind of kicking around for a while, or sometimes it's a turn of phrase that kind of lands and makes sense, that I think, oh, maybe I can shape something around this. So it can be anything from a one line that could potentially be a title or a jumping off point, or it can be, an approach, even if it's just the idea of, wouldn't it be interesting to write about this and from this perspective? And once I start to consider that, then I know I'm probably already writing it, so the idea is being formed. And yeah, it really depends where I am. If I'm sitting with an instrument around, then chances are I can dabble, and that's where I don't really have to consider the lyrics. Otherwise, I'm very much lyric led, and also almost like ideas led. And so that comes a little easier to me than lifting up an instrument and noodling away.
Well, you're about to release your 5th album, Light Entertainment. It's out on November the 15th. It's absolutely brilliant. I want to know, what does the title Light Entertainment mean to you, and how does it reflect the themes of the album?
Well, thanks. I really appreciate that the compliment on the album. It's, the album itself, Light Entertainment, was something that arrived quite late in the day. I was actually on a dog walk whenever it came to me, but I knew with how weighty the content and the lyrical content of the songs and right across the album and the themes, that I needed something to kind of counterbalance that. And so having a title that reflects and does kind of nod to some of those kind of themes, and I think there's a fair amount of this reference of instant gratification that we're always needing right now, because we're in a world that's so fast moving. It's fiber optic in that sense, and I'm I'm certainly I'm not trying to take the position of like, a Bob Geldof kind of role. I'm just as bad as anyone else. Where if if I don't get the thing that I want right here and now, then I'll become frustrated and try to either find another way, or I'll be distracted by some other means of entertainment, as it were. And so light entertainment sort of felt like a nice little juxtaposition, and also a relation to the themes of the record, almost like this is the front door, and then when you open it, then everything else is in there.
And you described it as an apocalypse record.
Yeah. Yeah, it felt, I don't know, when I started writing it already, and it still does. I mean, it's if you consider that all of the things that are happening right now in the world, if you were to even just like put all of the almost like title all of the headlines of every single thing that's going on, it seems like we're living in some sort of dystopian fucking hellscape at times, where and so there's an element of this reality that we live in that is so surreal and dreamlike, but we're currently living in it, which I find intriguing, because I grew up watching a lot of these futuristic kind of dystopian movies from the 80s and 90s, and and I think of like Escape from LA and Running Man, and all of these films that back then seemed so far-fetched and really as if this is like so far in the future. I can't ever see us moving into this kind of space, or living in a time like that. And then a couple of years ago, I remember standing in an airport, and there was a sign saying no hoverboards, and I thought, what the fuck is going on? And I know that they're not the back to the future hoverboards, but it's still that idea of, I didn't think that we would actually be living in this. And maybe it is a case of, when you're living in these times, it's really difficult to take a step back, to actually to change the vantage point and observe it from another angle. And so writing the album gave me that sort of sense of being able to reposition myself, and everything that I was finding about the current day and age just felt so apocalyptic, that once I leaned into that a little bit more, all of this, the kind of the world that I was creating started to make a lot more sense, because then I could picture, okay, so where are these songs going to exist? And so, an actual physical space in my mind that I could put them in, and that made it much easier for me to kind of collect the songs in that sense, and sort of round them up, and with a sort of story almost, this kind of start, middle, and end as well. And I've always enjoyed that about records. I always think there's such a kind of fine line between that and any sort of storytelling, and movies as well, in terms of, I like listening to records where I know where it starts, I know what the middle point is, and I know where I get dropped off as a listener. And that's exactly what I wanted to do with light entertainment.
And when you're writing the songs and you're putting the track list together, do you even sort of think about, side A of a vinyl album and then the side B in the journey?
Yeah. It's an interesting one, obviously, because vinyl is it's well and truly back in terms of merchandise, and how things are presented. And so I really enjoy being able to consider the track listing with that in mind, because that by the time side A ends, it's almost like intermission. And so, having a very weird intermission where, if it's, you're at this precipice or whatever, or it's like a really dynamic shift, and then your side B feels like it's on another planet, then that's never going to work. And so I think with the songs, because they were all recorded in the same very short space of time, it was never going to be anything that was so bombastic that as a listener you flip over the record player and you think you're listening to a different artist. But because I think it all sounds like one body of work. But it is an interesting consideration even sonically, to have to potentially nudge things around for vinyl, because there could be a side of the album that, I maybe didn't realize that's actually quite heavy in terms of, they're all quite slow toward the second half, or, suddenly you're almost offering, like, I remember years ago having a Rod Stewart album, and the album was broken up into, like, it was called like Saturday Night Out and then Sunday Morning something, and it was almost like his his energetic songs on one side and then the ballads on the other, which I thought was a really smart way of doing it. And so, not that I had to put in that much consideration, but it is something where, you know trying to consider the listener and how I would want them to experience the album. It's kind of no different from a film, I think, or any sort of art form where you, to a certain extent, you have to hand hold and pull people into a world, and then also along the way be able to, you know, um, be able to present something that they can understand, and that they can immerse themselves in, rather than, like, I enjoy albums that have lots of, big songs, but I feel like if I listen to a record, and I don't know whether you're similar, or if I listen to a record that's just wall to wall hits, I can't hear the cohesion, like, as an album. I just hear singles, and that's it. And it's just, it feels like there's no thread that's attaching these together besides, the band and the sound of said singer. Yeah.
Yeah, some of my favorite tracks, ever have been just album tracks, deep cuts within the album, you need. And by the way, you're talking about hoverboards. That's one thing I'm still disappointed that we don't have.
I know.
I remember watching that film back in, I don't know, when did it come out? Late 80s, and thought, happy days. In about 20 years, we're going to have those, but still not happening.
I know. I think I'm still waiting on the. I know, obviously, like, there's a variation of trainers without laces, but those ones that he had on where he hits the button and
Yes.
just, oh, fantastic.
Yeah, there is a variation, but they don't work exactly the way they do in the film.
No, and they should.
And they're about £1,000 a pair or something, probably more expensive. But yeah, I remember watching that and seeing them and going, I have to have them.
One of these days, Mark. One of these days.
Let's talk about some of the tracks. The album kicks off with "Oh My God, Know You're a God." Brilliant way to start the album. What I love in it, and this here really, I thought this was class, and I had to actually rewind it. We mentioned, this is the bit where we put the choir in. Was that intentional, or when you were sort of putting it together, you were just saying you thought, right, I'll just leave that in?
No, it was completely 100% intentional. I think, again, as someone who has always admired the hip hop approach to to songwriting, and even like the presentation and production, I think that, and I never hear that often in any other genre, but they're not afraid to kind of break the fourth wall, and also overdubs are really rife, and it's this kind of constant, I guess, reminder that, you feel that a song is going to go one direction and then it gets pulled another. And so I like the idea of sort of injecting this kind of sense of breaking the fourth wall for the listener. And also, because we were quite, apparently using samples of a choir, I just thought, in order to punctuate this, and if I'm a listener, and if I'm someone who the creator of the music respects, and, if they kind of feel like, oh, they're intelligent enough to know this, I mean, I could have left it alone and said nothing, and it probably would have been like, oh, it sounds like, a kind of sample of a choir. But in my mind, it was definitely a nod to a lot of hip hop tracks. I was actually listening to the new Tyler the Creator album earlier today, and yeah, those like little injections are very interesting. I think of, keeping the listener on their toes, and also just even for myself in terms of the process, it helps me to then kind of push the boundary a little bit more, because in the studio, I think there can be a sense of of safety over risk, because sometimes it's just a case of, if if you don't have a world of time to do these things, it's like just try to get the songs down as best as you can. And as much as I really admire really well produced albums, I think some of them miss that element of personality about them, or humor or something. Just that, I certainly am more interested in someone giving me more than just regular songs with "Here comes the big chorus." I want to feel something more than that, you know?
No, it was completely refreshing and brilliant when I heard it, and especially as well, because the song, you're dealing with sort of a quite heavy subject, aren't you? Really, so it was just brilliant, and it's not just that song on the album, all the songs on the album go off in different directions, and they take the listener just all over the place, which is brilliant. They're not just linear songs, which I love.
Yeah. Well, I'm the exact same. I'm really glad you enjoyed that. It's certainly, in terms of how I approached the songwriting side of it, it helped with that, because ordinarily, and any of the kind of recording that I had undertaken prior to that record, maybe the record before the Plz Stay album, started to suggest how I could maybe approach songwriting in a slightly different way, and that I didn't have to arrive with finished songs and then bring them to a studio or producer and inevitably find that, because the songs are so rigid and structured, that there is no room to play with them then. And so I, in the past, I find that a lot of the other musicians who were present, or the producer, they just kind of wanted to support the structure that was very solid and laid out. And that started to bore me, because I felt like, if I'm working with these really creative people, but I'm not giving them any room to actually be creative, they're just, and I understand the project's under my name. So I know that people would not want to, feel as if they're weighing in or trying to give an opinion where it's maybe not wanted. Um, I wanted to be able to loosen that completely. And so, in terms of the songwriting side of things with Light Entertainment, I basically walked in with very bare structure, like a thin skeleton, which was very repetitive in terms of the melodies. And my goal was to kind of almost build separate sections then, and to take things apart completely and then slot them back in. And so that almost gave us this sense of, okay, the rules are all broken, and now, how much can we just keep creating new things, and can we slot that back in there, and I wonder, would this work here? Which I know, that sort of process doesn't work for everyone, but certainly for this collection of songs, it felt right, because I think, if sonically I'm trying to reflect this very fractured and strange world that we live in, it wouldn't have made sense for everything to be so straight. And the idea of almost putting the songs into a washing machine and just like let them go, I felt anyway that it was the perfect marriage with these lyrics that were, so conflicted, and they were painting a world that is chaotic and cannot be controlled. And so, yeah, musically, I think it had to be an extension of that, which, being able to work with, I work with two guys, Danny Ball and Dan Byrne McCullough, and they're both individually fantastic at what they do. Dan comes at it from a composition side, and Danny is producer. And so, but they're all, they're both very fine producers in their own right. But when we work in a room together, there's a real, I guess, like a sense that we don't know where we're going to end up here, and that's kind of exciting. But I'm pretty much able to drive to get to the destination. I know what I want to come out the end of it, but some of the decisions made in the middle, I think it's become a bit more exciting to try things. And if it fits, then great. And if not, then that's okay too. It's just part of the process.
And that's what was great from a listener point of view. You didn't know what was coming next, but you were excited to hear what was coming next because each song is completely different.
Mm-hmm.
And again, as I say, within the song, they just changed direction, lyrically, sonically, in every way. And there's a few collaborations on the album. The one we just mentioned was with Morgana.
Mm-hmm.
You've also collaborated with Joshua Burnside. And
Mm-hmm.
the next track I want to talk about, Control Alt Delete with Liz Lawrence. What can you tell me about that?
I opened a couple of shows for Liz a couple of years ago, and I just thought she was an absolute powerhouse. A fantastic producer, songwriter, artist, and I've just always admired how she goes about her work. I thought Pity Party was incredible, and when I was writing the album, and in terms of all of the features, it was really important to me to not approach features in the way that I have always assumed that singer-songwriters end up using featured artists, which is as a backing vocal somewhere in the background. Generally, 7 or 8 times out of 10, it's a female vocal who, are fantastic songwriters and have incredible vocal range, but are limited to the fact that they're always going to be pushed somewhere in the background on someone else's track. And so, again, in terms of changing that approach and being able to throw out the rule book, when I was writing the likes of Oh My God and Looking for a Hit and Control Alt Delete, I was able to write with their voices in mind. And so I was able to, in terms of Liz, even before I had asked her, I had her voice in my head and I could separate sections of the song that I knew I want that to be her voice there. And I want her to sing this. And also, this section would be great if she could lead on that. And that really informed my songwriting as well, and was a much more interesting approach to the kind of production side of it. And thankfully, with every person that I had in mind, they all said yes. And just they took the tracks. Liz was sent the tracks. She worked on them in her own studio and sent them back. And there was nothing to kind of redo on it. There were no notes. She threw so much at us that we had a world to play with in terms of, all the different vocal passes. So yeah, it was fantastic to be able to work with Liz on that. And I think it really made the track kind of better for it,
Yeah, it's a great track. And I have to say, my favourite track, the one that just jumped out at me straight away when I listened, was Everything Considered.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely fantastic. And I love the video as well. What can you tell me about that song? I mean, again, it just goes off all over the place. It's amazing.
Yeah. It's funny because I remember when we were recording it at the time, and because there's a section in Everything Considered that completely just almost slides into a ballad toward the end. And I hadn't even been thinking about the Flaming Lips, but we were in the studio at the time listening back to it, and we were talking about how, God, it's sliding into like Flaming Lips kind of territory in terms of that segue, and then comes back around. So it was quite interesting because, again, I never considered them as a reference for anything leading into the recording process, and I just knew with that song, I came in with the guitar melody and all of the vocals and lyrics. And so it was really important for me to make sure that we were pushing a very fast tempo at it. And so we started with the finger snaps, and we basically built it around finger snaps. And that was really fun because then we removed all instrumentation, and I was basically, all my cues were just finger snaps at the start, which was bananas because then I wanted to try to organically do all of the finger snaps as well, which was, yeah, you really find out what sort of rhythm you either have or have not whenever you're just working off of a click track. But again, it was just another way of approaching the capturing of songs without it feeling so linear, and also with like constantly challenging me to kind of push it a little bit further in a different direction. And so that its song is it sounds so huge as well, but I think in terms of the drums and percussion, there's not a lot going on. It's just there's so much low end in it, but the
Yeah.
finger snaps are all over it. I just find them hilarious just because I can recall us kind of trying to catch them at the time, and it was one of the whitest experiences I've ever had in my life, with three white men trying to like click, off and on the grid. Yeah, it was very fun though. But yeah, in terms of that track, and there's maybe one or two others that I had always said, and always really enjoyed, that the kind of, what do we call, the Joy Division approach, with that little trick of pushing the tempo of a track, because lyrically you can get away with so much desperation and darkness without it sort of becoming quite obvious. And the idea of a song that is dealing with a lot of dark themes that becomes a bit of a foot tapper or a head nodder. I just find that really interesting, and much more interesting than approaching something, quite heavy and doing it like a bit of a dirge, or like an E minor to A minor, and it's like, Christ, here we go, and you're really gonna have to hope that your listeners sort of determined enough to get through it.
Light Entertainment is accompanied by a short film which features the legendary Daniel O'Donnell. So first of all, why did you decide to make the short film? Because we've seen the separate videos for the singles, and they're all really interesting and completely reflect what the album is about. So why did you decide to put the film together, and what made you ask Daniel O'Donnell to be in it? I know Joshua Burnside's in it as well, isn't he? I haven't seen it yet now, actually, but I've seen clips.
Josh and Morgan are both in it. So yeah, which was really lovely of them to come down. But yeah, the reason why I created the short film was generally because I've, in any other sort of album campaign where, the campaigns can drag on for quite a long time, and by the time the album comes out, as the band or artist, you're generally at a point where you're ready to let it go anyway, because you've had to live with it for so long, even before singles start to come out, and now the modern day kind of waterfall release sort of schedule that they have, where almost every song in an album comes out as a single, which elongates the campaign again. And the idea for me, or in my head anyway, of having to create music videos for something that's maybe the album's made over a year, 2 years, and you're having to go back to the well to create another piece of visual content. And again, on a shoestring budget, I just felt like, okay, if I'm going to capture any visual footage for this album, I may as well approach it the same way that I would like capturing the album itself. So I like to record in one kind of span of time and just capture everything, and then we just leave it at that. And so I had the idea whenever I was recording the album that I wanted to put like I guess like an accompanied sort of visual piece that would act as, the weird sibling of the album. And that made sense to me because I knew that if I capture it all really quickly, and if I capture it all around the, one kind of time frame, not only will I be able to keep it all themed and heavily themed and contained, but also it meant that I was buying myself time. And because it can be so taxing to be constantly on your phone uploading things, talking about singles, all of this jazz, there's a lot of, I guess like emotional detriment that goes into it, and a lot of like psychological detriment that can go into constantly having to engage with new content and social media. And so I felt like it was a healthy approach for me to capture everything at the very start. And then that meant that in its longest form, it's 13 minutes, but I can break that down to 60-second clips, 30-second, 15, 5, as little or as much as possible. And again, keeping it all thematic, it meant that there's there was no risk of me having to, so many months later, try to inject myself back into that world and and be a bit lost in terms of what is it I was trying to say. So I kind of found that part of the process was really interesting. Plus, being able to write the script for everything, I just thought was just a really fun process because it was different from songwriting. It was a nice challenge, and I think the whole kind of what I wanted to do was create this world that was, both very human and relatable, and also completely surreal. And so I don't think there's anyone in the world who defines that more than Daniel O'Donnell. So whenever I was talking to my partner Nikki about how I would really love to approach him about this, but I'm not sure. I want to create a character for him and make it really easy so that he will say yes. And so we were back and forthing on the idea of trying to maybe create something that's quite relatable to the world and to what has happened over the last few years. And we were kicking around the idea of how it has, it's become quite difficult for people. Post-pandemic era, it's quite difficult for people to engage outdoors at gigs, even in public at all. And so this agoraphobia that has become, pretty difficult for a lot of people is very, very present even still. So that's where the initial idea of Daniel's character came in, where he would be this salesman who is trying to offer you this respite that, if you aren't fit to go outside, he will do it for you. And so Nikki came up with the idea of the great outdoors with Daniel O'Donnell. And then after that, everything just kind of, it just wrote itself. And yeah, he basically said yes without really reading his part. And when he watched it after, he had no clue what the film was about, but said that he looked good, so he was happy enough. It'll be out with the album anyway from the 15th, so people will be able to watch it.
You'll be playing the Lyrics Theatre on the 14th in November as part of the project. What are you most excited about bringing light entertainment to the stage, and how do you envision translating its sound for live performances?
I think the most exciting part for me is the fact that I get to actually realize this idea that has been in my head for a while, in terms of presenting something in a way that was again going to be another sort of throwing of the rule book against the wall. And in my mind, it didn't make sense for me to create this album. It's very heavily themed. It's kind of a little bit bananas, and then to create a short film that again is quite surreal, and then be quite safe with a classic gig. So I feel like it's the third limb to this whole presentation, and I guess the nervous excitement of being able to pull it off and meld the world of live music and musical theatre is something that I'll know after the 14th. But I like the challenge, and I also like the idea of presenting something different to people, and maybe maybe opening the door for you can consume live music this way. And it doesn't, I think the Lyric Theatre has always been obviously quite synonymous with the arts and theatre, but in terms of live music, I don't really know too many gigs that have happened in there.
No.
And so I find it really intriguing to try to bring those two worlds together, and people who would enjoy both art forms and bring them into one space. And so creating that little bubble is going to be quite fun and incredibly surreal, because essentially what I'll be doing is it will be a live version of the short film, and where the short film was this existential crisis of why am I even trying to create this? Because, there are so many atrocities in the world. It's not even important right now. Like it feels like the wrong time. And also, will anyone even care? Is it just indulgent? So to do that in front of a live audience and basically have the existential crisis going, but it's about presenting a live show in front of them, while they're there actually watching the live show, just to me seemed, again, really intriguing to break the fourth wall to that degree and to not only let them in on my inner thoughts and, concerns, but also to break the barrier between stage and audience and create this kind of this whole world that they're immersed in and they're involved in, and there's a sense of turning the mirror on them and asking them like how they engage with everything that's happening in the world with social media. When how do how do you live? How much time do you spend doom scrolling? How do you feel about that? How do you feel about the world right now? Are you okay with things? And if you're not, then how does that make you feel? So there's going to be a lot of that, I think, but not in a terrible way. I think that might sound like a bit of a task, but it'll also be very fun and nice to again remove myself from the very typical gig or live music gig expectations.
You've released 4 albums prior to Light Entertainment, and in 2016 you won Northern Ireland Music Prize for Best Album for Let Bad In. So what was that experience like? How did that feel? Because it's a fantastic album again.
Really, I mean, it's quite difficult. I don't really enjoy award ceremonies. It's great to be nominated for anything and to be acknowledged, I think is fantastic. I don't necessarily feel 100% comfortable because it's not the motivation behind why I do what I do, but it's obviously, it's the gold star when you're, given any sort of recognition, and it helps to open a door, and it puts you, you go on a little pedestal. I was really grateful even to be recognized in that way. To be honest, on the day of, I was clearing off to Donegal so I could be as far away from it as possible because I didn't know that I was going to win. But then my manager at the time, Lyndon, who I love and miss dearly, he called me and he said, "Look, you need to be here for this. You're going to win the award." And I didn't want to. I didn't want to go, so he forced me to go, and I turned up. And so I was in the process of washing a pair of jeans at the time that I was just like, well, they'll do for they'll be there when I get back from Donegal. And so I quickly tried to tumble dry those and put them on and realized about halfway down in the car that they had not dried whatsoever. My legs were soaking, and they dried by about the time I got home. And it was a bit of a whirlwind. I went in, met Lyndon at the top of the stairs. Back then it was in the Mandela Hall. So we went downstairs and waited until there was a queue to say, and the winner is. I went up, got the award, was ushered off the side of the stage. I went up the stairs, out a fire exit door, and back home. And I was home probably I was in the Mandela Hall for probably about 40 minutes, and I was back home again. And then it was even more surreal because I was just sitting in the living room with the dog with this award thinking, what was that? It felt like a real fever dream, and my legs soaking still. But it was certainly really lovely to be recognized, and especially, in among a lot of great music that was happening that year and every year, to be honest. Like what comes out of Northern Ireland's fantastic. It definitely doesn't get the recognition it deserves. And I don't think the award gets the kind of, the kudos that it could bring to artists, but, it's neither here nor there.
If people want to understand the music of Ciaran Lavery, what are the 5 songs they should listen to?
Good question. I would say if you had to go across a whole catalogue, well, Shame, obviously, I'd be stupid to not say Shame. I kind of feel like that's
it's your
the
most
one
streams,
song,
isn't it?
Yeah, and it's the one song that people accidentally have listened to my music via. So I'll generally, if I'm talking to someone, and almost every time without exception, where they said they'll check out my music, they've come back and said, I realized I had your song Shame on a playlist, blah, 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 so many years ago. So I'd say that's a pretty good one for starters. I would say Left for America is probably a pretty good one. Again, kind of marking trying to think of like the sort of trajectory of my career as well. For And that was another kind of point. I would say Ockerville River is maybe one worth throwing in there. That was from the Let Bad In album. Um, I would say Can I Begin Again was definitely it marked a really important point for me, because that's when I started to realize that I didn't have to exist within the pigeonhole of singer-songwriter, and that I could branch out. And so, stylistically, that sounds quite dear to me in terms of it being a bit of a pivot. And yeah, I mean, everything considered, since it's your favorite, Mark, so it would be
It
remiss
is.
not to mention it.
It is. I really can't wait to hear that live.
I know it should be good fun.
You co-founded the only songwriting camp in Northern Ireland, the Soft Gut Song Camp. So what can you tell me about that? Why did you decide to put that together? And, what does it involve? What's it been like?
Well, the song camp, it's incredible. Myself and my partner Nikki, we conspired and put the camp together based on just our love for um, the music scene here, and also the music creators, and the fact that I grew up in Hageln, which was, there wasn't a music scene going on there, and I've always felt outside of a music scene, and I've always wondered how one is supposed to get into a music scene, and I think there's a feeling of isolation there, and the fact that for probably, well, since I was involved in music and anywhere in the last decade, the narrative of big fish, small pond, and it's time to jump abroad, go to London, go to America. It sort of, I think, was sometimes the death of a lot of bands here who could have stayed here and had a career and not had to, worry about going over to some expensive city, and then you find yourself working in order to live, and then you don't have time to actually do the creative thing that you went over to do there in the first place. So the idea of artist retention and musician retention, and also connectivity between songwriters, artists, and bands and producers, that's pretty much at the forefront of what we do. So, and it's not rocket science. We bring a group of attendees together. We put them together for 2.5 days at Analog Catalog Recording Studios, which is incredible. It's a residential studio. It's all analog, which, I mean, if you're big into your kind of analog music, it feels like a bit of a museum, in the best possible sense. And so they're there in Rathbryland, which is the middle of nowhere. So it sort of forces all of the attendees and people present to talk to each other. And I think, we never put pressure on anyone to create, hits or the next big song, but we basically just put these creatives into separate rooms, and they spend their daytime creating music without any preconceived ideas, and they have their evening time to chat to each other. And I think for us, for Nikki and I anyway, the end goal of people coming out with not only like new connections, but also friendships. And as cheesy as that sounds, but it's really important, especially in this very, I would say, like a selfish occupation and self-driven occupation, where you can forget how many doors can be opened by your peers, and they're not going to open those doors if they think that you're competition. So there's a better chance of people helping each other out if they know each other on a personal level. And so that's basically what we do as part of the song camp. We give them that opportunity to get to know each other, and then to further each other's careers by pushing each other along, which I think is much more beneficial than everyone assuming that everyone else is their competition.
And for anyone listening that would like to get on the song camp, how does it do it?
We have we're going to be opening applications for our 2025 camps probably within the next month. So if anyone is interested, they can follow our Instagram or Facebook on Softgut Song Camp. And yeah, we usually update there, and they can apply via an online application form.
I like to ask my guests the following questions, Ciaran.
Mm-hmm.
For us music fans, music is the soundtrack to our memories. What song or album, when you listen to it, brings back the best memories for you?
I would say the Weezer Blue album. It reminds me of like a really good summer when I was a teenager. I can't pinpoint any memories. I really enjoy listening to that album. There's something nostalgic about it, but at the same time, I know that it's related to some really fun memories of mine that again I can't, pinpoint. But that's a big one for me where it feels like putting on a warm sweater anytime I listen to it. Well, no pun intended, obviously with a sweater song on it. But so that would be there. Also the Green Day second album, name escapes me now. It had Armitage Shanks on it and a few other songs. And it has a direct relation to a summer that I had again as a teenager playing the PlayStation. And I think I was playing, what was it? Metal Gear Solid, something like that. And I have again this direct relation with it was just the perfect summer. I was young enough to not have any kind of major worries or concerns outside of, what am I gonna do? It wasn't even during school, so I didn't even have that to worry about. So I didn't have to worry about homework or any of that kind of thing. It was pretty much like I have my free time. And so I think those albums are really dear to me because they are directly related to that, maybe that freedom just of a summer outside of school.
If you could go back and relive one musical moment from your career so far, what would it be?
I would say yes whenever I was asked to jump on to a different stage at the Willie Nelson Luck Reunion Festival. Because what happened at the festival was that I was invited to play. There were 30 artists at it, and it takes place at his ranch, which is really surreal because it's essentially the set of a spaghetti western film that he has retained. And so it's like the dusty main street with the church at the very bottom and the saloon and all that jazz. And there was a storm that arrived during probably mid-afternoon, and a lot of bands had their sets cancelled because again there's only 30 bands and it just happens in one day. And I was basically given the option of going on to one of the other stages because I was initially supposed to be in the small church, or I could perform in the saloon. And in my mind, I thought, I want to play in the saloon. Of course, that sounds like great fun. And I had to stand on top of the table and play for people, not realizing that the other stage that I was offered, I think I would have went on ahead of Lucas Nelson. And I turned it down. Wow. So I would absolutely say yes, and kind of pretty much try my best to warm the stage for Lucas Nelson and his band.
That's me done, Ciaran. Is there anything you would like to mention before we wrap up? Anything else coming up in the immediate future?
No, I don't think so. I really appreciate you taking the time as well, Mark. It's great to just chat, and yeah, and I never take it for granted that this is, we're both kind of giving up our time here. So I really appreciate, first and foremost, you doing what you're doing, which I think is fantastic, and also for taking the time to listen to the album. There's so much music out there, so I really appreciate that you did that, and yeah, and all of the really nice words. They mean a lot.